Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here. Well, I'm back with my first ever build in over 4 months. It's been tricky getting in those hours at the workbench, however I've managed to crank this one out, so I really hope you guys enjoy it. Today we'll be building Tamiya's 2004 Porsche 911 GT3 in 1/24th scale, marking my first ever attempt at a car. So without further ado, let's get started. Inside the box we don't get a whole load of plastic. However, what we do get is nicely wrapped in protective film, preventing any nasty scratches from forming. The kit also comes with some nice chrome parts and rubber wheels, which is a nice touch. Taking a look at the parts themselves, the beautiful Tamiya quality was clear from the get-go. Despite being tooled back in 1998, there was barely any flash present on the parts, and the sharpness of the detail was definitely up to scratch. Don't get me wrong, you can definitely tell that it's not a brand new kit, but considering its background, I'm very impressed. My only minor gripe with the main parts was the fact they're moulded in different coloured plastic. The yellow is alright, however the black made it really hard to evenly prime the model when it came to it, and something about the gunmetal parts meant that even after removing any seam lines, you could still see the seam line remnants on the surface of the plastic despite it being perfectly smooth. This made it kind of hard to judge when a part was properly cleaned up. The clear and chrome parts, however, were absolutely flawless. No scratches or imperfections here. With the parts analysed, let's get right onto the build. As I'm sure the car modelers amongst you expected, the build began with the construction of the underside. This included putting together the car's sway bars, drive axles and shock absorbers, along with the exhaust and underside protective panels later on. All construction was carried out with Tamiya extra thin cement, and it went very smoothly. I then moved on to priming the underside along with its sub-assemblies, unifying the multicoloured plastics and preparing it all for more precise detail painting. For this, I made use of Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black, diluted to a ratio of about 70% Mr. Leveling Thinner and 30% paint to achieve a nice and smooth finish. This was sprayed through my 0.4mm Ultra, which I find to be the optimal nozzle size when dealing with primers and varnishes, due to the larger particle size. Painting the silver components was next up in the workflow, as metallic parts work best when applied to a completely uniform black undercoat, something that would not be possible if I'd sprayed other colours beforehand. My paint of choice when it comes to metallics has always been Mr. Super Metallics, as I find they are capable of producing some absolutely jaw-dropping results. They also dry pretty fast as a result of their lacquer-based makeup, which meant I could very quickly move on to the exhaust's heat damage effects. A great little detail that I was very excited to practice. Now, I'll warn you I'm not the best at heat damage, as I've had very little experience with it. However, I find that Tamiya clear acrylics can work absolute wonders on top of a metallic base coat. As I say, I'm no expert at this effect, but as you can see in the video, just having the orange and blue clear paints can make a world of difference to an otherwise boring exhaust component. This is slightly off topic, but these clear acrylics are also fantastic for imitating varnishes over wood effects and other slightly tinted finishes, so definitely pick some up if you can. Tamiya Flat Red was then used to pick out the brake calipers and suspension springs, thinned down with isopropyl alcohol, which makes it perfect for brush painting. Following this, I moved back onto painting the underside colours. Before we tackle the main Bodywork custom shade, which is featured in places on the underside, I first had to patch in the engine block, again using the same Mr. Super Metallic aluminium shade as earlier. Now for the Bodywork shade. As this model was built as a gift to my brother, I consulted him for the Bodywork shade, and we came up with this sort of dark metal flake grey mixture. It's made up of 50% Mr. Super Metallic stainless steel, along with equal parts German grey and black, the two latter paints being Tamiya shades. The result turned out pretty nice in the end, especially those imitation metal flakes. This was then sealed in with a high gloss finish, matching as closely as possible to what the main bodywork will look like later on. This gloss coat was created using thinned GX100 gloss, which is my favourite product when aiming for high gloss finishes. Well, that looks pretty decent to me. I have to say, removing masking tape is one of my favourite processes in the hobby, as I'm sure a lot of you will agree. With the tape removed, I could complete the construction of the underside by adding all of those sub-assemblies that I constructed and painted up earlier. This was a flawless process thanks to the fantastic engineering of the Tamiya kit itself. I'll shut up for a bit now and let you enjoy the underside taking shape. So, with all of that done, it's onto the interior. This was quite an interesting process from the start, as Tamiya supplied some self-adhesive felt that you could cut up and then stick to the back seats, imitating the fabric in the real vehicle. The shapes were cut out using some templates included in the instructions, and then carefully positioned in place using the edges of the seats as a guide. A cotton bud was also made use of in some places to firmly press the fabric into place. As you can see, it turned out pretty decent in the end. Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black makes its second appearance at this stage. The entire interior was coated with this primer, including the fabric seat covers, which incidentally ended up being the actual interior shade as it went down perfectly smooth and I didn't require a paint layer on top. It also looked pretty good on the fabric, which I was very happy about. It even looked a bit darker than its surroundings, helping to differentiate the material whilst also keeping a level of overall uniformity in the interior. This uniformity, however, did need to be broken up a little bit, as there were basically no shadows, which I artificially added in the form of a German grey highlight layer. As you can see in the video, this was thinned down pretty heavily with MLT and sprayed along any creases or areas where the light would hit the surface differently. I also applied this effect to the seats, making use of masking tape in order to keep a sharp line along any stitches, providing a pretty nice 3D appearance on the surface. I had to spray very close to the model when doing this in order to avoid unwanted overspray. Time for Tamiya Red to make a comeback, because who doesn't love red as an accent to black? Details on the seat were picked out with this shade, along with other areas of the interior trim and small elements that would benefit from being picked out in red. This line on the dash was pretty tricky, however a fine brush and plenty of patience produced a pretty acceptable result. Because who needs masking tape, right? The final painted elements in the interior were picked out using Bodywork model color aluminium, an acrylic shade that I find to be pretty handy in situations like this, as it doesn't require thinning if you're just using a tiny bit. It was then time to whip out the microset and sole, as the interior features some of the very few decals included in this kit. Tamiya decals often get a bad rap for being too thick and non-conforming in most cases. However, I'll be honest, these were some of the best decals I've ever used full stop, let alone just from Tamiya. I must have got lucky, as I encountered no issues with these at all. All the paintwork and decals were then sealed in with another clear coat, this time making use of GX114 Flat Clear from the Mr. Colour GX range, which I quite often use for my flat coats. I've recently started using Tamiya lacquer clear coats, however in my eyes they're of pretty comparable quality, so it's really down to personal preference. With that done, all that was left to do on the interior was assemble it. Again, I'll shut up now and let you guys enjoy the interior coming together. See you again when it's time for the bodywork. Right, let's begin the most exciting stage of the build. As the body was moulded in pretty much one piece, there was very little construction required before I could get down to some lovely painting. This just involved adding the trim along the sides, as well as the front bumper, wing mirrors and spoiler assembly. These all came together with absolutely no issues whatsoever. It's time to prime. I reckon you can all guess what I'm using for the primer at this point. I did, however, thin the surfacer down a little bit more than before for this, just to ensure that I had a nice smooth base layer to work off from. The thinner paint does mean that you have to move the airbrush around a bit faster to avoid spidering or orange peel. However, this isn't too big of an issue once you get a feel for your airbrush. And as you can see, the result it produces is very nice and shiny when it's still wet, with no signs of patchiness. This is exactly what we want to see. Despite my efforts, there are still a few dust particles here and there that got stuck in the primer, so the next stage was to use some 3000 grit sanding sponge to get rid of them. The sandability of this primer is one of the reasons why I love it so much. It responds so well to being polished and sanded, allowing for some flawless, smooth results. Now for the return of that custom metal flake grey mix that I used before. Just like the primer, this was thinned down a little bit more than usual, allowing for a very smooth finish to be achieved. You'll notice that some areas have been sanded down to the base yellow plastic. However, this is completely fine, as after a few rounds of metallic shade, these were pretty much unnoticeable. In reality, I probably should have reprimed these areas, but what can I say? I was being lazy and it turned out fine nonetheless. Gloss time. The first round of clear coats on the coachwork was of course created yet again with GX100 High Gloss, creating a very nice sheen on the surface of the car from the get-go. You might have noticed in the video that I start my spraying sweeps pointed away from the model, passing onto the model and then back off again. I do this for a couple of reasons. For one, it means that any spatter when I compress the trigger is aimed away from the car, and two, it means that I can adjust my desired flow rate before I begin spraying the model. This is vital, as if the varnish is coming out with not enough pressure, the particles of varnish will be slower in the air and may partially dry before they've hit the surface, ruining the effect. With GX100, you should ideally be spraying it as wet as possible to allow for self-leveling on the surface. Following this rule will land you with these glass-like results. Now for something that I've never tried before, polishing with sponges and compounds. I was very lucky at this stage, as it was around this time that I was contacted by Hobbyist Haven, a model supplies retailer who were looking to collaborate. They were kind enough to supply me with this Display micro Dremel, along with polishing sponges and a series of lovely polishing compounds, all free of charge, allowing me to boost this build to another level. Let's see what they can do. I began polishing the model with 2000 grit compound, along with the corresponding sponge. Despite the relatively high roughness, even this level of polishing really gave extra life to the gloss surface. The thickness of the polishing sponge, along with its relatively high squishiness, allowed for polishing to even be done around non-uniform surface features, such as the wing mirror. I have to say, I was really enjoying this process, and the Dremel massively reduced the time it would have otherwise taken. Next up is the 4000 grit compound, along with the 4000 grit sponge. The fact these sponges were fixed in place using Velcro really eased the whole process, allowing for very fast transitions between the grades of polish. This is definitely a commendable feature. Again, as you can see in the video, moving up to the next layer of polish continued to improve the surface to a very noticeable level, which I was very pleased about. One drawback that I will mention, however, is the battery life of the Dremel itself. As it's quite small and requires quite a bit of energy to achieve the torque required, it does drain quite quickly, in about 15 minutes or so. As a result, I had to recharge the Dremel 3 times when polishing the car. Just something to keep in mind. The final polishing stage that I chose to go up to was the 6000 grit mark, and I did receive a 10,000 grit compound. However, I was very pleased with the result at 6000 grit, so chose to just leave it at that. Overall, I'm very pleased with the outcome I got from these polishing products. Display is known for producing some pretty handy tools, so I'm glad to see that this reliability extends into the realm of polishing. Many thanks yet again to Hobbyist Haven for supplying these products. As a little bonus, Hobbyist Haven were kind enough to supply me with a 15% discount coupon that you can all use in their store on their range of display tools. They can often be hard to find in the UK especially, so it's by no means a bad deal. The code expires on the 30th of June this year, so if you fancy anything, definitely make use of that before it expires. Many thanks yet again. With the majority of the bodywork pretty much perfected, it was time to patch in the black trim elements around the bottom of the car. These were masked off using Tamiya masking tape, and then sprayed using a highly diluted coat of Mr. Colour Flat Black. This required a few layers to build up, however it was worth it as the result was perfectly smooth. The same diluted mixture of MLT and Flat Black was also sprayed onto the insides of the window panels, imitating the anti-glare frosting around the edges. The masking was carried out using a combination of Tamiya flexible masking tape, along with Bodywork masking putty to patch in the middle. Finally, the black was applied to the chrome-plated wheel rims in order to unify them with the paint scheme. Ideally, I should have dissolved this chrome plating off before painting, however I was heavily restricted by the time I had left at the workbench, so instead skipped this step. The rubber tyres included in the kit then popped right on, with very little effort. This was quite a satisfying process, I have to admit. Some mini paint touch-ups were required after this, however nothing too big, as you can see. Next up, Mr. Surfacer white primer was loaded up into the airbrush and used to spray the front number plate. The reason I'm using a white primer here and not a white paint is the fact that it's got some incredible coverage properties, despite making use of white pigment. This meant I could pretty much bash it out in one nice coat, decreasing the chance of any masking tape leaks or ripples in the surface. A Molotov chrome marker pen was then used to patch in the reflectors for both the side indicator lights as well as the rear light reflectors. Patching in the rear lights with a pen as small as this was quite tricky, as it dries pretty fast and going over the same spot twice can ruin the effect. However, I think it looks pretty decent in the end. The cover glass for the indicators and rear lights was then painted on the back side using orange and red clear Tamiya acrylics, brush painted on and thinned down yet again with isopropyl alcohol. On reflection, this should have probably been done with masking tape as it was slightly shoddy, however it's not massively noticeable so shouldn't matter too much. These lights could then be popped right into place with a small dab of Tamiya Extra Thin. The headlight reflectors and cover glass could also be fixed into place at this point, however no painting was required for these as you'd expect, as they're pure white lights. The wheels were a little bit tricky to get on due to the layers of paint and chrome on the locator pins. However, softening these layers with a bit of Tamiya Extra Thin allowed them to slide on eventually with a little bit of force. The final steps then consisted of adding the clear window components to the inside of the bodywork, and then adding the bodywork to the rest of the car. These were both pretty easy processes, as Tamiya included handy locator pins all over the place. So here is the car at a stage I called complete. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how the build went. It's obviously not the most jaw-dropping car model out there, as it is of course my first attempt. However, I reckon it could have gone a lot worse. Those polishing products really worked wonders on the bodywork, creating a pretty effective sheen with only tiny amounts of orange peel visible in some areas. This could have been alleviated with more sanding prior to the second gloss coat however, but I'm not massively fussed. I can see my own reflection as it is, so that's good enough for me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the model as well as your tips for improving next time, so feel free to comment down below with any input. I always appreciate the feedback you guys give me. With all of that said, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to all of my amazing Modelling Weekly channel members here on YouTube. Your support is absolutely invaluable and I can't thank you all enough. If you'd like to find out more about what being a channel member entails, feel free to click that link in the description down below to view all the amazing perks available to you. For example, this video was actually available to members a week before the premiere. Members also gain access to all my studio photos, build updates, and the MW members zone, so there's plenty to get your teeth stuck into. Many thanks to all of you once again. I'd also like to thank Hobbyist Haven yet again for their contribution to this build. Their site has a bunch of great products that are pretty hard to find in the UK, so don't forget to make use of that generous 15% discount code if you fancy picking any Display products up. I really hope you enjoyed that video, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Stay safe and keep on modelling. Bye!